Hey folks, so it's now time to start talking about my brand new book, Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Can Teach Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. It's chock full of critical information that you're going to be able to use, and we're going to be able to use not just on this channel, but out there to defend our fundamental right to keep and bear arms. Stay tuned. Let's start talking about the book right now. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and New York Times best-selling author. If you haven't subscribed to the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel, please do so. Show your love for the right to keep and bear arms. All right, folks, so breaking news. We've talked about this a little bit. Now I'm going to start digging into this. Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Can Teach Americans About the Right to Bear Arms is my recent book that I just released, and I'm happy to report on Amazon we've already hit several bestseller lists, so it's already selling, even though I really haven't done a lot of publicity for the book. But I want to talk about it because it's not just about the book, it's about making sure that you in the Second Amendment movement have the information you need to advance the ball and our rights under the Second Amendment. First of all, I wanted to give you the two fundamental arguments I'm going to make in this book, and there's a lot of other little ones we're going to cover in future videos. There are many points that are made in support of the right to bear arms in my book, Disarmed. The first one is that it vindicates our response, and actually the Ukrainians' response to the Russian invasion, proves beyond a doubt that the wisdom of the Founding Fathers for codifying in our Second Amendment the right to bear arms has been proven to be completely true. What do I mean by that? Is that the idea behind the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms was to make sure that we always had an armed citizenry, not an armed government, but an armed citizenry full of Americans that not only had firearms, but also knew how to use firearms for various things, not least of which is the possibility of a foreign invasion. And one of the critical things I'm trying to do in this book, Disarmed, is yes, we always talk about the importance of you and I having firearms to deal with like criminals and localized problems. But what a lot of people have not talked about, and one of the main purposes of the Second Amendment, is to deal with more global or large-scale problems, whether it be some sort of major domestic huge problem or potentially a foreign invader or whatnot. You never know when these things are going to occur. And the idea of the Second Amendment, of course, was to make sure that Americans were prepared and ready and had arms to ensure that we could step up and defend each other, our families, and our country in the event it was necessary. So that's the first thing I want you to understand, that it vindicates the wisdom of the Founding Fathers in all respects. The second critical thing is that, to me, it puts the anti-gun liberals, the anti-gun left here in America, in checkmate. And what do I mean by that? If you start to look at the anti-gunners here in America, who on the one hand make statements like, we don't need guns, no one needs an AR-15, no one needs guns. And then these are the exact same people who are running out to send firearms, including, by the way, millions in small arms and tens of millions of rounds of small arm ammunition to Ukraine to use to fight the Russian invasion. So it really just checkmates the anti-gun left when they say, who needs these firearms? The answer is obviously the Ukrainians need them. So obviously Americans do too. And of course, the last point is you should never, ever, ever allow your society to be disarmed, because you make yourself vulnerable in a way that the Ukrainians did. And we're going to talk a lot about the mistakes the Ukrainians made over the last 20 years. You're going to find that very interesting in future videos. But for now, I just want to hammer home the two critical points. The first is that the Ukraine war is the ultimate real-life lesson of what can happen when a country disarms its citizens. You see, whether it's against domestic criminals or even against a criminal state, private arms are extremely important. And I want to go back, in addition to the fact that we have a Second Amendment, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, right? The fact that it's actually written in to the Constitution, specifically into the Bill of Rights, that alone demonstrates the view of the Founding Fathers, how important making sure we had armed citizens was. But beyond that, I want to also quote you a very important member of the early Americas, early United States Supreme Court, Joseph Story. Extremely important guy. The reason why he's important is I think, was the youngest ever Supreme Court justice. He was put on the Supreme Court by President James Madison. He also was a longtime professor of law who wrote many important works about the meaning of the United States Constitution. And Joseph Story's work is regarded as so important, incredible, and serious and correct that the Supreme Court of the United States, even to this day, relies upon the work of Justice Joseph Story and the commentator Joseph Story to sort of have an understanding of what the Founding Fathers meant when they wrote the words of the Constitution, when they wrote the words of the Second Amendment, and when they talked about the history that went into that. Joseph Story is a very important source. More importantly, or I don't want to say more importantly, but equally importantly, you know about Joseph Story if you watch movies. Specifically, if you ever watched the Steven Spielberg movie Amistad, which is about the slaves that were on a Spanish ship that rebelled and basically overthrew their Spanish captors, and then they sailed into the United States. It was Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story that wrote the famous Supreme Court opinion that was made famous by Steven Spielberg's movie Amistad. It was Joseph Story who wrote the opinion that freed the slaves, and a very important freedom-loving kind of opinion that speaks to the American notion of freedom and liberty that our Founding Fathers endorsed. So he is a very important character. Now let me tell you what Joseph Story said about the Second Amendment, and then you can see why it's so important when applied to the Ukraine. Specifically, Joseph Story said, quote, "The militia is the natural defense of a free country against sudden foreign invasions." Did you hear what I just said? The militia is a natural defense of a free country against sudden foreign invasions, domestic insurrections, and domestic usurpations of the power by rulers. Now, we all know that at the time of the founding, the militia was all Americans composed of the militia because that's where the militia drew from. It drew from the armed citizenry because, as we know, for example, of the Militia Act of 1792 that Congress passed, Americans who were in the militia as defined by the federal government had to bring their own firearms with them to militia duty, meaning their own arms, their own ammunition, their own black powder, their own pouches, and so on. So the point is that you needed the body of the armed Americans from which to draw from for the purposes of the militia. That's why Joseph Story says the militia was so important. But Joseph Story goes on to talk about specifically the individual right to bear arms. Such an important quote I'm about to read that it was used by the United States Supreme Court itself in the McDonald versus Chicago case of 2010 that said that the right to bear arms is such a fundamental constitutional right on par with other fundamental constitutional rights such as the right to free speech and the right to free press that it should be treated the same. This is the 2010 United States Supreme Court case of McDonald versus Chicago. This is what Justice Alito writes, and he quotes literally Joseph Story about the Second Amendment in the McDonald opinion. So it's just not Mark Smith. It's not just the Four Boxes Diner. It's the Supreme Court itself in the McDonald case. This is what Sam Alito quotes in the context of quoting Joseph Story, which Story writes, this is what Joseph Story wrote about the right to bear arms. Quote, the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic. That's right. The right of the citizens to keep and bear arms is justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic. Obviously, the palladium of a free society is the essence of it. It's the most important part of it. It's what makes us Americans. Because as you know, going all the way back to Greco-Roman times, the three components of a citizen consisted of the right to vote, the right to own property, and yes, of course, the right to bear arms. If you did not have the right to bear arms, you were a serf, you were a subject, you were not a citizen, and that is not what it means to be an American. And don't take my word for it. It's the United States Supreme Court of McDonald and Justice Joseph Story at the time of our founding, or just after the time of our founding, relied upon by the United States Supreme Court. The reason why this is so important is that Joseph Story literally is writing at the time of the founding, or just after it, about the importance of an armed citizenry to thwart foreign invaders. So, of course, here you have in Ukraine a country that contemplated adopting the Second Amendment, which we're going to get into that quite a bit, the history of that mistake they made, because part of this book, Disarmed, What the Ukraine War Can Teach Americans About the Right to Bear Arms, includes the mistakes that Ukraine made that we as Americans should never make. The big one, of course, is disarming yourself and making yourself dependent on the kindness of strangers. We don't want that in America. That's not what we do in America, but that's what the Ukrainians did, to terrible consequences because they got invaded by Russia. So, of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, what did the Ukrainians do? They immediately try to arm their citizens. The government of Ukraine starts to hand out tens of thousands of fully automatic weapons to any citizen that will take them, even though many of these citizens, if not most of them, had no familiarity with firearms. In fact, many of the citizens of Ukraine were literally using plywood cutouts of AK-47s or AK-74s to try to learn how to use firearms. Well, it's too late to try to prepare your citizenry for an invasion when the invasion is occurring. You want to do it ahead of time, not only because you want to deter the invasion from occurring in the first place. So many people, for example, say, well, the United States can never be invaded. And, I completely disagree with this for many reasons, not least of which is the Japanese were interested in invading the United States, but they invaded Korea and China instead. And other people certainly are interested in, invading the United States. If they could get away with it, I'm sure the Mexican cartels would be very excited to invade the United States and take over our stuff if they thought it was possible, but of course it's not. And one of the reasons why it's not possible is that, everyone has guns here, not just the government, not just our military, but also armed citizens. The other major point that Disarm What the Ukraine War Can Teach Americans About the Right to Bear Arms is the fact that I think this checkmates the anti-gun left, because the anti-gun left keeps saying things like, no one needs guns, no one needs AR-15s, and of course, as soon as the invasion of Ukraine occurred by the Russians, these same anti-gun Americans, anti-gun politicians and political actors started to say we need to send weapons and arms, including small arms and small arm ammunition, to Ukraine for what purposes? To fight. These are the same weapons that they say no one needs, and yet all of a sudden Ukrainian citizens, that's right, the citizens needed these arms, because as soon as the Russians invaded, again, the Ukrainians handed out tens of thousands of these weapons to their citizens to help fight off the Russian invasion. And keep in mind, it's not just about, one of the benefits of an armed citizenry is not just deterring the invasion from occurring in the first place, it also makes it impossible to occupy a territory. So, for example, when you have a California congressman like Eric Swalwell make comments about, well, if the American government got into a war with Americans, in some crazy hypothetical world he's talking about, but if that were to ever occur, it would be a short war. The government wouldn't, because the government has nuclear weapons. That's obviously stupid, because as we can see, and this is one of the critical points I make in the book, Disarmed, is the Ukrainians do not have nuclear weapons, and yet they're fighting a nuclear power in the form of Russia, and yet the Ukrainians are using, among other things, small arms and small arm ammunition to fight off the Russian invaders, even though the Russians have nuclear weapons. It just goes to show you that having nukes has certain value, but when it comes to occupying land, the nuclear weapons don't have a lot of value. And I point this out because, Eric Swalwell makes the comment about, well, we're going to win because we have nukes, but what is he going to do? He can't just nuke America, because then you can't occupy America. And again, even if a foreign invader were to conquer part of America, they would still have to occupy and keep it, and that is not very easy to do when everyone around you has guns and doesn't like you and wants you to leave because you're infringing on their freedom. So again, it just goes to show you that an armed citizenry not only deters the invasion in the first instance, which is the best case scenario, in a worst case scenario where you are invaded or attacked, it also allows you to make sure that the occupying force cannot successfully occupy you forever. You have the best opportunity to be able to kick those people out, and the founding fathers knew this. We know this by some of the quotes they had. But beyond that, of course, I think the fact that the anti-gun left is now checkmated on guns, because here's the thing. We all know that the anti-gun left overwhelmingly supports arming Ukrainians to fight the invaders from Russia, and they're not sending, and this is key, the anti-gun Americans, such as Joe Biden and the others that support sending arms to the Ukrainians, they are not sending gun-free zone signs to Ukraine. If that's all it took, it would be a lot less expensive than sending arms over there if we just had to print up a bunch of signs that say no guns allowed and put them on the Ukrainian border. The Russians obviously wouldn't be able to come in with guns. It'd be a whole lot easier, but obviously that's just an absurd idea because it will never work. Yet, of course, when it comes to Americans, these same anti-gun politicians who want to arm Ukrainian citizens to the teeth, despite the fact that the Ukrainians, thanks in part to their government, did not properly prepare, did not adopt a version of the Second Amendment, did not adopt a right to bear arms before getting invaded, right? They want, the American politicians want to deny Americans the right to bear arms and yet make sure that the Ukrainians have the arms so they have the right to bear arms to fight off the Russians. Just to give you a quick example of the kind of anti-gun organizations when it comes to preventing Americans from having arms are the same people that want to make sure the Ukrainians have arms. Here's a simple example that I have in my book. There's an organization here called Occupy Democrats. And here's what they tweeted out after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Quote, breaking, Ukraine's interior minister announces that 10,000 automatic rifles have been handed out to the civilians of Kyiv as they prepare to fight tooth and nail to defend their homes against Putin's invasion. Retweet if you stand with the brave Ukrainian people, period, close quote. That is what Occupy Democrats sent out on Twitter. 5 months later, they also sent the following out. Tell me if you see the inconsistency here. Quote, breaking, if you support an assault weapon ban and are thrilled that President Biden announced that he is determined to ban weapons of war like assault weapons, and he is not going to stop until they are outlawed like they were in 1994, please retweet and follow us, period, close quote. Same group, there you have it. That is the same viewpoint, by the way, of people like Eric Swalwell and Joe Biden and virtually the entire anti-gun left. They want to punish Americans, even though we have a fundamental right to keep and bear arms codified in our Constitution itself. And they want to supply similar arms, small arms, to Ukrainians to fight the Russians, which I understand, where the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government considered adopting the Second Amendment about a decade ago, and they did not do it, and they did not prepare, and they did not develop a private gun culture in the way that we have here. And they did not make sure that the right to bear arms was recognized and codified and protected like we do here. Nevertheless, the anti-gun politicians in America want to provide the Ukrainians with small arms while taking them away from us. These are just some of the many points that we're going to go over in my book, Disarm, What the Ukraine War Can Teach Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. There's a lot more to come, but I did want to get you just to give you a little bit of taste of the book. We'll talk a lot more about this and many other topics here at the Four Boxes Diner Second Amendment channel. And again, if you haven't subscribed, please do so, and we'll see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.